Big news out of Boca Chica today on progress for the SpaceX Starship program. Booster 7 conducted what appeared to be a successful 7-engine static fire of its powerful Raptor flight engines. This video was posted by Elon Musk in a tweet Monday afternoon. He subsequently said that this booster will be transported back to the high bay at Starbase for robustness upgrades, and a new booster, number 8, will be placed on the orbital launch mount for testing. He says the next major test will probably be a complete stack wet dress rehearsal, followed by a full 33 Raptor engine static firing. His tweet optimistically predicts that the critical engine test milestone will happen, quote, in a few weeks, unquote. NASA briefed the media about plans for a crucial cryogenic fueling test of the Space Launch System rocket. Here are the highlights of the Artemis audio-only teleconference.
As noted, the primary objectives of the test is to look at those two new seals that you've discussed and see how they perform. We've got some modified cryogenic loading procedures, which I'll talk a little bit about, and both Jeremy and John will talk some more about that. We're going to look at the core stage and ICPS load. We're going to also get into the start for the engines to see if we can get a good bleed, get them cooled down properly, and we'll also do the pre-press demonstration to verify our valve timing. And then we're going to monitor the core stage LH2 tank for a period of time. The test is objective-based, and we're not going to go into terminal count. And let me just talk about one more thing, and then I'll turn it over to Jeremy to get into more details. You know, we've been gone through a number of operations with this vehicle. We're learning more about this vehicle. It's a new machine for us. One of the things I think that we really have a better appreciation for now, which is what we will be demonstrating here on Wednesday, is what we call kinder and gentler loading operations. And they talked about that the last time we got together. Folks who aren't familiar with how this works, LOX is relatively dense. It's about the density of water, and we pump LOX. And so we have big pumps, and LOX is pumped into the vehicle when we do our loading operations. Hydrogen is very light. It's an extremely high-performing fuel. In fact, you can't get to the moon in a single launch without hydrogen. That's how good it performs. And you don't actually pump hydrogen. You actually use pressure to move hydrogen. We have a pressure sphere sitting at the pad, and we monitor and change that pressure for the loading operations to either increase or decrease the flow into the vehicle. We're going to be doing what we call the kinder, gentler kind of loading operations. Jeremy will talk about this a little bit more. We're going to lower that pressure a little bit at the beginning of the chill down procedures and then up through the transition to fast fill. And we think that will really help with the pressure and temperature transitions that the system sees. That's just one of many different things that we're incorporating in this demonstration to make this a robust operations, to really make it have the best possibility for success. And we've looked at a whole bunch of different things, and we're incorporating a whole bunch of different things in this demonstration that people get to see. The last thing I want to add is that we continue to work with the range in a proactive and a very collaborative way, and we're continuing to have technical discussions, and we would anticipate later on after the crowd demonstrations we'll hopefully get some more feedback from them.
At T-minus 9 hours, at about 3:40 Eastern in the morning on Wednesday, we'll begin the BDA clear of all non-essential personnel. About an hour after that, or at T-minus 7 hours 50 minutes, we get into air to GN2 changeover. After that, we go into a 2.5-hour built-in hold. We expect the launch director to give us a go for cryo loading at about 0700 Eastern. The pre-press test to be a couple hours or a few hours later, right just before 1 p.m. Eastern, or at T-minus 2 hours 18 minutes. And then we expect all things to be completed by about 3 p.m. If all is going well. As Tom talked about kind of the kinder, gentler loading, what we're really doing is we're really trying to minimize both pressure spikes and thermal spikes. So our team really thought about how we can go about doing that. What we're going to be doing is slowly bringing up the pressure on the LH2 sphere, or the storage tank out at the pad. And so it's going to be a very slow, steady ramp. We're also controlling the main fuel valve for that fill drain there. And again, kind of spend some time really thermally conditioning it before we open it all the way. And so the team feels that this helps mitigate some of the risks that we saw, which, again, with hydrogen in particular, you're talking very, very extreme temperatures, and so really just trying to slowly introduce some of those thermal differences and reduce thermal and pressure shock. What we did this time around, we had a little bit more time, so we've largely automated all of the procedures. So we're down to only 4 to 5 manual commands throughout the entire procedure. In terms of training, we tested for 3 test runs, validated all of the software. We then loaded that software, and the team has been able to do 2 more sims since then. So really gotten quite a bit of training in over a number of days. We've also built in pauses where the sequencer or that automated software piece will stop and require console operator input. And so, we've also put in prerequisite logic to help avoid any commands being able to be sent unless, the conditions are right and they're in line with the steps. So team has really kind of stepped back, look at everything that occurred over those last 2 attempts, and then spent a lot of time on the software, which was really good.
As the size of the indentation, it was just under 0.01 inches. Now, that doesn't sound like a lot, but again, we're dealing with hydrogen, the smallest particle on the atomic chart. So, an indentation of that size, that does provide an opportunity for a pressurized gas to leak through that. And then in terms of the concentrations that we saw on our attempt on the 3rd, as I recall, it was somewhere between 2 and 3 times the accepted limit, and it was repeatable with multiple attempts to work through the leak or heal or seal the leak. I don't have the exact numbers in front of me, but as I recall, it was 2 to 3 times. I don't know, Jeremy or John, if you have the numbers or anything to add.
Mike, so what we saw with the system is it shot up to about 8% as we got into kind of a thermally stable sort of condition out at the low hydrogen temperatures. And basically, that was repeatable. Every time, from that point on, whenever we put, greater than a very low amount of pressure, a couple of PSI, you would see that leak spike up. But yeah, so it was 2 times the LCC limit, and there are indications that it would go much higher than that if we allowed it to.
We had a successful loading operation on launch attempt 1. In fact, if it wasn't for that LCC, which we now realize was a bad LCC, we would have continued with the count and we may have launched the vehicle. And so this didn't show up on launch attempt 1. We go into launch attempt 2, same seal, same everything, and now we see something and then we see an indication. So there's certainly more than one aspect to this condition that we don't really fully understand. So what we've done is we've looked at every path possible that could be related to it and making sure that we've done everything we can to have a good condition with the seals, a good loading operations, got the physics dialed in a little bit more. And so that's really a multivariate approach to something that I don't know if we'll ever know conclusively exactly how that happened, how we had successful loading operations in the first attempt, and then we saw this fairly early on and very distinct. And so that's not intuitive, at least to me.
So those changes, very well may have played in. We do expect that, within the age life of these seals and all, that once we get to an operational status, that we'll be able to map out the machine's corners, if you will, and understand these signatures. We did a lot of testing, the ground system guys did here prior to that, and so we've gone back and looked at all that data, and we were outside of those ramp rates, right? That's what we're fixing, is those temperature and pressure ramp rates, and so we were outside of those. And so that's one of the things that I think we ought to focus on. But again, in 48 hours, I'm going to have a pretty good witness to whether these processes have fixed it or if I need to think of other things, and the whole team needs to regroup on that. But no, you guys have it generally right. I will say I do think that the system will be consistent once we map out, if you will, the corners of our operational box, and we will do that.
Hi. Thank you for doing this. 2 questions for Mike, I think. First of all, there's a 70-minute launch window on the 27th. Is that at all a concern, given that you've had couple hours before, and there may be some challenges, obviously, as you get down closer to the terminal count. And another one is about the loss of vehicle risk. I guess it was a few weeks ago you mentioned a mission risk of about 1 in 125. And I'm just wondering if you could talk about how your team arrived at that figure. You know, I'm obviously not an engineer, but I've spoken to a lot of them about this, and it just seems like that estimate's pretty optimistic for a new rocket and a spacecraft on its second flight. Thanks.
The 70-minute window, you know, any launch window is a good window, a good opportunity to set up for. Obviously, longer launch windows give you more flexibility. If you have a weather or technical or issue with the range where we have a range safety or public issue with the public, we do. Longer windows just provide us with more flexibility. So there's really no concern with a 70-minute window versus a full 120-minute window. We just have reduced flexibility to work through problems regardless of the nature. It could just be, you know, a thunderstorm rolling through. In terms of the risk number, the 1 in 125, again, that is from what we call a probabilistic risk assessment. There's a whole host of factors that go into it, including system fault tolerance and redundancy. How many propulsive you know, engines do you have to maneuver in space? We have a primary engine and we have auxiliary engines that we could download to. How prolific is the micrometeoroid and orbital debris environment based on the latest models, and that factors into it. There's a whole host of other factors, including you know, the thermal protection system, the parachute system, test data that we've gotten back from the test programs. We had a very robust parachute test program out at the Yuma Proving Grounds in Arizona that you know, enabled us to get this far. We've done a whole host of tests with the rocket and the spacecraft. So all that information is fed into this probabilistic risk assessment. It's compared against just known design features or design limitations within the vehicle. And then there's also just some what I'll call historic or corporate knowledge that's fed in across all the programs in terms of where some of the most likely causes of loss of vehicle could stem from. So there's a myriad of factors that go into the probabilistic risk assessment, and based on the assessment that our own experts have pulled together, that was the number that they came back with. Analysis or a tool that enables us to understand what are the primary drivers. So again, I'll pick on micrometeoroid and orbital debris. That is one of our top risk drivers. It is an order of magnitude greater than our command and data handling system. You know, the flight computers and command and data handling systems on spacecraft now are very robust. They're very mature. We've tested the heck out of these systems. So in terms of relative risk, we know that orbital debris is way at the top of the list in terms of risk driver, and we know command and data handling is towards the bottom or the tail of the risk profile. So that's where these tools are very useful. They're again, they're not absolute numbers, but it provides some sense of what is driving the risk, and is it on par with something that you would consider to be an acceptable level of risk headed into a mission and a launch, as opposed to something that really requires additional mitigation.
Yeah, I think it's kind of cool. You know, the orbital debris is such a big influence that we shape our mission trajectories to try to minimize that risk. So we actively do things in the mission design. Mission managers help us out doing this stuff, and we try to minimize the risk of the vehicle. So that's the cool thing about the tool, is you can actually dial some things around a little bit and lower your risk, and that's how we use the tool.
We've gone through the fault tree. We've identified every possible action or incident that could cause us to experience that leak. I will say that one of the things that really stands out, just to say it again, is we did some testing at the Launch Environments Test Facility, and we mapped out this seal. So we didn't show up unknowing at the pad, but the thermal mass and the way we change pressures once you put the new system together did have these ramp rates of pressure and temperature that are just vastly different than what we tested in our test facility. And so we're going back to replicate something that we do know and something we've been successful at and something we called the seal to. And so, I don't really want to hang my hat or dismiss or any of those options. Like I said, I've got one equation, 4 or 5 unknowns, and I can come up with several plausible scenarios. And that may not even be as plausible as many of them, particularly the ones where we're operating outside of those ramp rates where we did before. So it's a machine. It's going to operate like we tell it to operate within its life expectancy, and that's what we're trying to return to, and we'll map that out and do that.
Yeah, I don't know, Jeremy, if you have any additional thoughts.
Maybe just a little bit of perspective. So the 60 psi, we have what's called kind of an envelope limit that's normally provided during operations, where we try and keep it within 45 psi. As that was exceeded, our reactive control logic kicked in, and it was down. It was about a 4-second spike. So we kind of have that envelope limit, which is what we intend to operate at. The design was qualified to significantly higher, about 120 psi. And again, you didn't see the leak right away, right? You didn't see the leak until you started getting to those thermal environments at the fully kind of cold hydrogen temperature. That being said, kind of like what John's saying, right? We've created a fault tree. We're mitigating this potential cause, as well as QD compression, as well as FOD, things like that, and just really trying to make sure that any potential instances, we're working through that fault tree and mitigating either by procedures, logic controls, and things along those lines. So trying to knock everything out that we can.
Yeah, and this is Tom. Yeah, Mike and I have an unfair advantage. We actually have one of the 8-inch seals up here at headquarters. We holding it and squeezing it and all these things that you can do to the seal. And it's made out of Teflon. It's got a little spring behind the backbore spring. So it's a kind of a complicated thing when you talk about a pressure, temperature, rapid spike coming through the system as you go through your initial loading operations. And we were at a higher pressure, which is, I'm really excited to get the slower pressure sphere going for the initial loading operations. And when you're heating up the system, you're chilling it down, the system's a little bit warm. So that hydrogen is creating its own pressure. It's not just the head pressure in the sphere, but it's actually kind of warming up a little bit as you transition into the early processes. That's a very kind of complicated thing to understand. Then there's this indentation that we saw, and then there's this momentary command, which may or may not have had any real effect at all. So it's just like, I know it's hard if you haven't seen the fault tree, you haven't sat through all these meetings that we sit through. A lot of different things going on, and it's really wouldn't be, we could come to you and say, hey, we know exactly it was this if we could, but we just don't know. And so we're trying to be representative of the fact that it's probably a multivariate thing that just was not as robust a process as we would have liked, and it was something that pushed it over the edge and started to leak. I think our best way of dealing with that is we've looked at every aspect, everything I just talked about, and then we're going into some real physics about lowering the thermal and pressure transients that occur particularly during the early loading operations. And I think that would be a positive step in a really good direction. It took a lot of time to actually sort through that, make sure we would have sufficient pressure for the loading operations, but recognizing that we didn't need the higher pressure until we got into the fast fill, which was later on in our fill. So that just analysis and the testing. And, really, I think that this gives us the best possible opportunity with all those robustness features that we've talked about, and we get to find out here on Wednesday. So we're going to learn pretty quickly. And so hang tight. I think you're all having really good conversations, but I think we're just going to be a lot smarter Wednesday afternoon about 3:00 p.m. So that's where I think we can really give you a much better answer.
We're going to go when we're ready. And the public safety aspect of this is not our risk to weigh. It is the Space Forces and the ranges to see. But in terms of the reward of flying this flight, we have said from the outset that this is the first in an increasingly complex series of missions, and it is a purposeful stress test of the rocket, of the spacecraft, prior to flying crew on the next mission. So, you know, the reward is getting the validation of our new rocket, of our new spacecraft in the actual flight environment. And when we do that, it depends on a whole host of factors, and this is just one of those factors, and we do not control the risk acceptance of the flight termination system. So that's the only thing I would add.
Markets recovered slightly today after last week's losses. 16 of our WSN Space shares watchlist rose, with Maxar and Planet Labs gaining the most. Terran Orbital took a big hit, losing exactly 10% of its value. Reporting from cyberspace, this is correspondent Karen Calvis.